He bought 3 Apache women in public. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was a bright, clear morning in the small town, the kind of morning where the air felt fresh and almost alive. People were slowly starting their daily routines. Shopkeepers were arranging their goods neatly on the wooden stalls. Children were laughing as they chased each other along the cobblestone streets, and the faint sound of a flute could be heard from the market square. Life in the town was usually calm, predictable, and uneventful. That morning, however, an unusual tension hung in the air, though no one could yet name it. At the center of the town square stood a man named Thomas. He was not someone people often remembered. He appeared ordinary at first glance, wearing a simple brown coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. But there was something about the way he carried himself that drew attention. He walked with a sense of purpose, each step measured and deliberate, as though he were moving according to some plan that only he understood. As he entered the square, the chatter of the townspeople gradually quieted. It was subtle at first, a pause here, a turn of the head there, but within moments the square had become unusually still. People instinctively felt that something important or perhaps troubling was about to happen. Thomas stopped at the center of the square, where a small wooden platform had been placed for announcements and town gatherings. He looked around, taking in the faces of those who had begun to gather. There were farmers, traders, and artisans, all curious and cautious. Mothers held their children close, and the elderly leaned on their canes, squinting in the morning sun. Nobody spoke. Even the usual hawkers selling bread or spices had paused. The silence itself felt heavy, almost like the air had thickened. In his hands, Thomas held a bundle wrapped carefully in cloth. He set it down on the platform with a soft but deliberate thud. The movement was slow, intentional, and it drew every eye. There was a murmur that ran quietly through the crowd, not of words, but of recognition that something unusual was unfolding. Thomas straightened up and began to speak, his voice calm but firm, carrying clearly across the square. He announced that he had brought something remarkable to share with the town, something that would challenge their understanding of fairness, culture, and community. As he spoke, the crowd edged closer, their curiosity stronger than their caution. People whispered to one another, trying to guess what could be hidden under the cloth. Speculation ran through the square like a subtle breeze. Some guessed it was a rare animal, perhaps a gift from a neighboring town. Others thought it might be some unusual artifact, maybe something valuable or even magical. The tension grew with each passing moment. The anticipation was electric, yet it was tinged with unease. Something about the situation felt out of the ordinary, and the townspeople instinctively knew that they were witnessing an event that would not be easily forgotten. Then, Thomas slowly uncovered the bundle. Inside were 3 beautifully crafted dolls. But these were no ordinary dolls. They were lifelike, dressed in elaborate traditional attire that reflected the rich cultural heritage of a distant community. Their presence was mesmerizing. The fine details of their garments, the delicate expressions on their faces, and the careful craftsmanship made them appear almost alive. The townspeople gasped in unison, a mixture of astonishment and wonder passing through the crowd. Even in a small town accustomed to festivals and occasional parades, such a sight was rare and striking. Thomas explained that these dolls were not just toys. They were representations of an ancient tradition, a way to honor the artistry, resilience, and spirit of a proud community. He spoke of the history behind their creation, how each stitch, each bead, and each brushstroke told a story of survival, creativity, and identity. The townspeople listened intently, some nodding in admiration, others in quiet contemplation. For many, it was the first time they had been exposed to a culture so far removed from their own daily lives, and the experience stirred a mix of emotions: respect, curiosity, and a hint of discomfort at realizing how little they truly knew about the world beyond their town. As the morning progressed, Thomas invited the townspeople to approach the platform one by one, to see the dolls up close and appreciate the care that had gone into their creation. Children reached out their small hands in awe, while adults examined the details more carefully, discussing what they saw with neighbors. The silence that had first enveloped the square transformed into a quiet hum of fascination, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were witnessing something meaningful. It was a lesson in observation, in patience, and in the power of cultural expression to move people in ways that words alone could not. By the time the sun had risen higher in the sky, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a deeper sense of reflection. The town square, once filled with ordinary daily activity, had become a place of thoughtfulness and shared wonder. The dolls, standing in their quiet dignity, had achieved more than Thomas could have imagined. They had captured the attention, respect, and imagination of an entire community. And in that moment, everyone understood that sometimes the simplest objects could carry the weight of history, culture, and emotion. The town would remember this morning for years to come, not just for the beauty of the dolls, but for the strange, unsettling, and yet inspiring way in which a single act had changed the rhythm of their everyday lives. Even the silence, which had been so terrifying at first, had turned into something powerful, an invitation to pause, observe, and reflect. The day after the dolls appeared in the town square, the town was buzzing with conversations that couldn't be contained. Even those who usually kept to themselves found themselves drawn to the topic. People discussed Thomas and the dolls in markets, along the streets, and outside their homes. There was a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and unease. Some found it fascinating that a stranger had come to their town and introduced them to something so unique, while others felt a quiet suspicion, wondering why he had brought them in the first place. Thomas, meanwhile, had not left the square. He stayed, quietly observing the crowd from a distance, as if he were measuring their reactions and understanding the impact of his gesture. He had chosen this town deliberately. Its people were hardworking and honest, but they rarely encountered events that challenged their perspective. He knew that introducing something unfamiliar could spark conversation, reflection, and perhaps even a change in the way they thought about the world. A few townspeople gathered near him, daring to ask questions. "Where did these dolls come from?" one elderly man asked, his voice cautious but tinged with curiosity. Thomas smiled gently and explained that they were created by artisans from a distant region who had dedicated their lives to preserving their traditions through craft. Each doll represented a story, a lesson, or a memory passed down through generations. As Thomas spoke, he described in detail the work and dedication required to make the dolls, the hours of stitching, painting, and careful shaping. The crowd listened, captivated. They could sense the care behind every detail and began to realize that these were more than simple objects. They were a connection to history and human creativity. Children were especially drawn to the dolls. They sat in the front rows of the square, eyes wide, imagining the lives of the people who had inspired the creations. They asked Thomas endless questions, wanting to know everything: how the dolls were made, what the colors meant, and what the patterns represented. Thomas answered with patience, telling stories that painted pictures in their minds. He spoke of families who worked together, teaching their children the skills that had been passed down for generations, and of communities that celebrated life and heritage through their art. The children listened with rapt attention, their imaginations ignited in ways that school lessons had never achieved. As the day continued, some adults began to discuss the deeper implications of the dolls. A merchant remarked on the importance of preserving culture in a rapidly changing world. A teacher noted how such stories could inspire young minds to learn about traditions beyond their own. Even those who had been skeptical in the beginning started to feel a quiet respect for the effort and history embedded in the dolls. For a moment, the town felt smaller in a good way. It was no longer just a single community of familiar routines, but a place connected, even briefly, to a larger, more complex world. Not everyone was immediately convinced, however. A few townspeople whispered among themselves, concerned that the dolls were some kind of trick or deception. They wondered why Thomas had chosen their town and whether there was an underlying purpose they didn't yet understand. But even these doubts could not diminish the effect the dolls had on the majority of the people. The beauty, craftsmanship, and story behind them were undeniable, and even those who remained cautious found themselves drawn in, compelled to look, reflect, and think about what they were seeing. By mid-afternoon, Thomas suggested a demonstration of the dolls' cultural significance. He had brought a small, simple stage where he placed miniature props and backgrounds. He explained that the dolls were part of performances in their original community, used to teach lessons about kindness, courage, and cooperation. The townspeople watched as he moved the dolls carefully, showing scenes of daily life, celebration, and teamwork. Though small, the movements seemed alive, and each scene carried a message. The children clapped in delight, the adults smiled in appreciation, and for a moment the entire square was united in quiet wonder. As the demonstration ended, Thomas encouraged the townspeople to ask questions again. This time, people were more engaged, more willing to share their thoughts. Some asked how they could learn more about the traditions behind the dolls. Others wondered whether they could support the artisans who created them. Conversations began to ripple through the square like a river, growing stronger and more thoughtful with each passing hour. People debated, reflected, and even argued gently, but all of it was rooted in curiosity and respect. The atmosphere was alive with learning, connection, and shared human experience. Toward evening, the square started to empty slowly, but the energy remained. People returned home carrying stories to tell their families, thoughts to ponder, and a newfound awareness of a culture different from their own. The silence that had been so heavy the previous day had been replaced with understanding and reflection. Even in quiet moments, the memory of the dolls lingered in the minds of the townspeople, a reminder that even small things can carry powerful meaning. Before leaving, Thomas carefully wrapped the dolls again and spoke to the remaining crowd. He explained that they would be leaving soon, but the lessons they represented would remain. "It is not just about the dolls," he said. "It is about remembering the stories, the traditions, and the people who made them. That is something that can travel with you wherever you go." The townspeople nodded, some with tears in their eyes, touched by the simplicity and depth of his words. That night, as the town settled into quiet darkness, people reflected on the events of the day. Some thought about the skill and patience of the artisans. Others considered the value of tradition and culture in their own lives. Children dreamed of faraway places, imagining themselves learning, creating, and performing as the dolls had. And in that quiet reflection, the town began to feel different, not because anything had been forcibly changed, but because something meaningful had been shared, something that connected them to a larger world and reminded them of the power of creativity, respect, and understanding. By the time the stars appeared in the sky, the story of the dolls had already begun to spread beyond the town. Travelers passing through spoke of the remarkable display, friends exchanged news, and the square became a place remembered for its moments of wonder and reflection. The town had been touched, subtly but profoundly, by something both beautiful and extraordinary, and the lessons of patience, attention, and appreciation would linger long after the dolls had gone. The following morning, the town seemed different, though most people could not yet put their finger on why. Even the air felt lighter, as if it had absorbed some of the excitement and curiosity that had filled the square the previous day. Thomas returned once again, but this time he didn't stand at the center of the square immediately. He walked slowly among the people, greeting them with quiet smiles, listening to the murmurs and conversations. There was a sense that the town itself had changed overnight. People were more attentive to each other, more observant of their surroundings, and more willing to pause and reflect. Thomas began by inviting a group of townspeople to join him in a discussion about the lessons behind the dolls. He explained that each one had a story tied to values like courage, empathy, teamwork, and patience. He wanted them to think about how these lessons could apply to their own lives and their community. Some were hesitant at first, unsure how a simple doll could teach such things, but the more Thomas spoke, the more they began to understand. He asked them to imagine the people who had crafted the dolls, the effort and care involved, and how every stitch, color, and movement was intentional. The townspeople started to realize that these were not just objects, they were living symbols of tradition and human effort. Children were particularly enthralled by this new approach. Thomas asked them to describe what they imagined the dolls were thinking or feeling in each scene he presented. Their responses were vivid and creative. One child suggested that a doll representing a mother figure was teaching kindness to her children, while another imagined a doll showing bravery in the face of a storm. Thomas encouraged them to share their ideas openly, praising each one for its insight. Slowly, the children began to feel connected not only to the dolls, but also to the larger human stories behind them. It was as if the dolls had become a bridge to empathy, imagination, and understanding. Meanwhile, the adults began discussing the impact of tradition and culture in their own community. A few town elders spoke about the importance of preserving stories and customs, while others suggested ways in which the town could support local artisans and craftspeople. Some merchants, inspired by Thomas's words, considered offering small spaces in their shops for exhibitions of crafts and cultural displays. Teachers and school administrators thought about incorporating lessons on culture, history, and art into their curriculum, using the dolls as a starting point for storytelling and learning. The ideas flowed freely, and soon the square was filled with energy, not of noise, but of thoughtful dialogue and creative thinking. At one point, Thomas introduced a simple exercise. He asked each person to choose one doll and imagine a story for it, describing its journey, challenges, and triumphs. The townspeople eagerly participated, offering tales of bravery, friendship, and overcoming obstacles. One man described a doll that had traveled across mountains to bring news to a distant village, while a young girl told the story of a doll that taught children to work together to save their town from a flood. Each story was different, yet all reflected values that resonated deeply with the people listening. As they shared, the townspeople laughed, nodded in agreement, and occasionally wiped tears from their eyes. For the first time in years, they were engaging in storytelling not as observers but as participants, creating shared experiences that strengthened their sense of community. The dolls themselves seemed to take on a new significance. No longer were they simply objects of beauty. They had become symbols of connection, imagination, and learning. People began to recognize that these small figures could inspire big ideas, and that understanding another culture, even through a simple doll, could broaden one's perspective. They saw that lessons in kindness, courage, and empathy were universal and could be applied regardless of age, background, or experience. The dolls were teaching without words, silently guiding the townspeople to reflect, imagine, and grow. As the day moved on, Thomas guided the townspeople in a small workshop. He taught them how to observe the dolls closely, noticing details that were easy to overlook. The tiny patterns in the fabric, the expressions on the faces, the way each gesture suggested movement or emotion. He encouraged them to sketch, write, or simply describe what they saw. People who had never drawn a picture in their lives found themselves inspired to try. Children filled notebooks with colorful illustrations, while adults wrote short stories or reflections. The square, once quiet and still, was alive with creativity and engagement, a testament to the power of art and imagination to unite a community. Evening approached, and the town square began to empty slowly, yet the energy and excitement lingered. Families returned home carrying their drawings, stories, and new ideas. Neighbors discussed what they had learned, reflecting on the values represented by the dolls. Conversations that had once been trivial or mundane were now filled with meaning. People spoke of courage, empathy, and respect, and the town seemed to pulse with a newfound sense of purpose. Thomas took a quiet moment to himself, standing at the edge of the square and observing the changes. He felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the dolls had sparked more than curiosity. They had inspired reflection, dialogue, and connection. He knew that true learning and understanding often began with small steps, and that even something as simple as a carefully crafted doll could open doors to empathy and imagination. As night fell, the townspeople gathered around their homes, sharing stories and thoughts with family members. Children proudly showed their sketches, while adults explained the lessons they had learned. The town seemed more alive, more thoughtful, and more connected than it had in years. In a place where life was often predictable and ordinary, a simple act of sharing culture and creativity had sparked a transformation. And so, part 3 of this story captures a town in the midst of awakening, not through force or instruction, but through wonder, curiosity, and imagination. The dolls had become more than objects. They were catalysts for reflection, discussion, and understanding. The townspeople were beginning to see the world and each other through new eyes, appreciating the power of patience, observation, and storytelling. The lessons learned that day would not fade easily. They would remain in the hearts and minds of the community, quietly shaping the way people thought, acted, and connected with one another. By the end of the day, the town had changed, though subtly. The lessons of courage, empathy, and creativity were no longer abstract ideas. They had been experienced, discussed, and shared. And in the quiet that followed, even as Thomas prepared to leave for the evening, the people knew that the impact of the dolls and the stories they represented would continue to resonate for a long time. The morning of the 4th day began with a sense of quiet anticipation. The town, though accustomed to its routines, had grown restless with curiosity. People arrived at the square earlier than usual, eager to see what Thomas had planned next. Word had spread quickly, and even those who had stayed at home the previous days found themselves drawn to the crowd. The square was alive with murmurs and speculation, each person wondering what new lesson or demonstration might unfold. Thomas's presence had become an event, something that brought the entire town together in ways that had not happened in years. Thomas arrived carrying a small wooden box. Unlike the previous days, when the dolls themselves had been the focus, today he hinted at a more interactive experience. He placed the box on the platform and invited a small group of children and adults to gather around. The crowd leaned in closer, curiosity written on every face. With careful hands, Thomas opened the box, revealing an assortment of miniature props, tiny trees, bridges, animals, and other pieces of scenery. He explained that these were tools to help bring the dolls' stories to life, to allow the townspeople to create their own narratives and explore the lessons embedded within each scene. The participants were encouraged to choose a doll and a set of props and to imagine a story for themselves. At first, some hesitated, unsure of how to begin. But as Thomas guided them with gentle prompts, asking questions about courage, friendship, and problem-solving, they began to immerse themselves in the exercise. Children were the first to embrace it fully, arranging the tiny props and creating adventures that were filled with excitement, bravery, and discovery. Adults followed, often more cautiously, but soon their stories revealed wisdom, experience, and insight that complemented the children's imagination. One group of children created a scene in which a doll had to cross a treacherous bridge to deliver an important message to a distant village. They debated how to ensure the doll's safety, discussing teamwork, patience, and strategy. Another group imagined a doll helping a small group of animals find their way home through a dense forest, highlighting themes of empathy, leadership, and problem-solving. The adults, observing the children's creativity, began to reflect on their own lives, realizing how these simple exercises mirrored real challenges they had faced or were currently facing. It became clear that the dolls were not just toys or objects of art. They were tools for understanding life and human behavior. The town square, once quiet and predictable, became a lively hub of activity. People moved from one story to another, sharing ideas, offering suggestions, and collaborating on scenes. There was laughter, thoughtful silence, and occasional exclamations of surprise as someone discovered a new idea or perspective. The dolls, though small, had become focal points for learning, imagination, and dialogue. Thomas observed quietly, occasionally guiding participants with questions or comments, but mostly allowing the townspeople to explore their creativity freely. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Thomas introduced another element to the day's activities: the importance of reflection. After each group created their story, he asked them to explain the lessons they had learned from their scenes. What challenges had the dolls faced? How had they overcome them? What could people learn from these stories about courage, kindness, and cooperation? The townspeople began to discuss these questions openly. Some shared personal experiences, drawing parallels between the dolls' journeys and their own lives. Others offered insights into how the dolls' lessons could be applied to the community as a whole. The square became a place of dialogue, where people not only created stories, but also reflected on their meaning and impact. One particularly memorable story involved a doll helping a group of children rebuild a small bridge that had collapsed in a storm. The participants discussed the importance of planning, teamwork, and persistence. One man, a local carpenter, explained how the story reminded him of rebuilding his own workshop after a fire, and how he had relied on the support of neighbors and friends to succeed. The children listened intently, realizing that courage and cooperation were not just ideas in a story. They were qualities that mattered in real life. The connection between the dolls, adventures, and real-life experiences deepened the townspeople's appreciation for the lessons being shared. Thomas also encouraged the townspeople to consider the perspectives of others. He asked them to imagine how the dolls felt in each story and how their actions affected those around them. This prompted discussions about empathy, fairness, and respect. Adults reflected on how these qualities could strengthen relationships in the town, while children learned to think about the feelings and needs of others in a thoughtful way. The dolls had become more than objects of curiosity. They were mirrors reflecting the values, hopes, and challenges of the community itself. As evening approached, the square had transformed completely from its ordinary state. The simple activity of arranging dolls and props had sparked creativity, dialogue, and reflection on a profound level. The townspeople had come to understand that learning and growth could happen through play, observation, and collaboration. The dolls had served as catalysts, but the real transformation had occurred within the people themselves. Families walked home together, discussing their stories and the lessons they had learned. Children were animated, eager to share their ideas with siblings and friends, while adults reflected quietly on how small, thoughtful actions could create meaningful change in their community. Before leaving, Thomas gathered the townspeople and offered a final thought for the day. "The lessons we have learned today," he said, "are not limited to these dolls or to this square. They are part of us, and we can carry them wherever we go." Courage, empathy, cooperation, and creativity are not just ideas, they are practices. By noticing them, discussing them, and acting on them, we can make our community stronger and more connected. His words were met with nods of agreement, smiles, and a sense of quiet understanding. The townspeople felt a shared sense of purpose, knowing that the experiences of the day had changed them in small but meaningful ways. That night, the town settled into a peaceful calm, but the impact of the day lingered in the minds of everyone who had participated. The dolls, now carefully placed back in their boxes, rested quietly, but their influence remained. Families discussed the stories they had created, neighbors exchanged ideas about how to apply the lessons, and children imagined new adventures they would create the next day. Even the streets seemed different, as if the town itself had absorbed the energy, creativity, and reflection of the day. In Part 4, the town had reached a deeper level of engagement and understanding. The dolls had moved beyond their physical form to become symbols of creativity, problem-solving, and empathy. The townspeople had discovered that even small actions, careful observation, and thoughtful reflection could lead to profound insights. The day had been filled with energy, laughter, and learning, leaving everyone with a sense of accomplishment and inspiration. The square, once an ordinary place, had become a stage for growth, connection, and shared discovery. As the stars appeared in the sky, Thomas quietly packed the props and dolls. He looked back at the square, now empty but filled with memories, stories, and the quiet energy of a town that had been touched in a meaningful way. He knew that tomorrow would bring the final chapter, where the lessons learned over the past days would be reflected, celebrated, and remembered. The transformation of the town was not complete, but it was well underway, and the impact of the dolls' presence was certain to last for many years to come. The fifth day began with an unusual sense of excitement in the town. People were arriving at the square earlier than usual, eager to see what would happen. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, a feeling that the lessons, stories, and reflections of the past few days were about to reach their full meaning. Children ran ahead to find the best spots near the platform, their eyes shining with curiosity. Adults followed more slowly, chatting softly among themselves, reflecting on the activities of the past 4 days. Even the usual morning routines, shopkeepers setting up, farmers carrying their goods, felt different, as if the town itself had been subtly transformed by what had come before. Thomas arrived carrying the dolls, now carefully placed in their protective cases, along with the miniature props and background pieces from the previous day. He placed them on the platform with care, as if they were precious treasures, which, in a way, they were. But today, the focus would be different. Today, Thomas explained, the town would not just observe or create stories. They would reflect on the meaning of everything they had learned and celebrate what they had discovered together. The townspeople were eager, yet also quiet, sensing that this day would mark the culmination of the experience. Thomas began by asking the people to recall the stories they had created over the past days. He encouraged each person to share what they had learned, how the dolls had inspired them, and how their own perspectives had changed. A child spoke first, describing how imagining the dolls' adventures taught her to be braver when facing challenges at school. Another child spoke about teamwork, sharing how creating scenes with friends and siblings showed the importance of cooperation. Adults, too, shared their reflections. One woman said that the dolls reminded her of her own family history and how traditions could teach lessons that are often overlooked in everyday life. A man mentioned how observing the dolls and thinking about their stories helped him solve a problem he had been struggling with at work. As each person spoke, a sense of community grew stronger. The square, once filled with curiosity and excitement, became a space for deep reflection. People listened to one another with respect and attention, nodding and smiling as they connected the lessons of the dolls to their own lives. It was clear that the dolls had become more than objects. They had become teachers, guiding the townspeople toward understanding, empathy, and insight. The lessons of courage, patience, cooperation, and kindness were no longer abstract ideas. They were now part of the community's shared experience. Thomas then invited the townspeople to create a final, collaborative story using the dolls and props. Unlike previous days, this story would not be made by individuals or small groups. It would be a story created by the entire town. People worked together, arranging dolls, props, and backgrounds, discussing each scene carefully and contributing their ideas. Children suggested adventures filled with energy and imagination, while adults offered guidance, ensuring that the story conveyed meaningful lessons. Slowly, a story emerged, one that reflected the values the town had been exploring: courage, empathy, friendship, and the importance of helping one another. The story began with the dolls facing a great challenge, a difficult journey through unfamiliar lands, where they would need to rely on courage, wisdom, and the support of friends. The townspeople worked together to decide how the dolls would overcome obstacles, solve problems, and ultimately succeed. Each contribution added depth and meaning to the story, and everyone present felt a sense of pride and connection. The story became a reflection of the town itself, a community learning, growing, and supporting one another through challenges and adventures. As the final scene of the story was completed, Thomas asked the townspeople to step back and reflect. He explained that what they had just created was more than a story. It was a representation of the lessons they had learned, the bonds they had formed, and the insights they had gained. The dolls, though small and inanimate, had inspired a journey that mirrored the real-life journey of the town, a journey of learning, understanding, and connection. People looked at each other, realizing how much they had grown together over just a few days. The energy in the square was electric, but it was a quiet, thoughtful energy, a mixture of pride, wonder, and appreciation. To conclude the day, Thomas spoke to the entire town. His voice was calm and steady, carrying across the square so everyone could hear. "The dolls are not just objects," he said. "They are reminders that courage, empathy, cooperation, and creativity are all part of who we are. Every story we create, every choice we make, and every challenge we face is an opportunity to practice these values. The lessons are not in the dolls alone. They are in you, in this town, and in the way you live and connect with one another." The townspeople listened silently, absorbing the words and feeling the weight and importance of what they had experienced. Families hugged their children, friends nodded to each other, and neighbors exchanged smiles of understanding. The town square, which had been the stage for curiosity, play, and creativity, had now become a space of reflection, growth, and unity. Even the children, who had spent the past few days imagining adventures, felt a sense of accomplishment and connection. They understood that learning and growth could be fun, meaningful, and shared with others. Before leaving, Thomas carefully packed the dolls and props once more. He reminded the townspeople that the lessons they had learned did not end with the dolls' departure. "Carry these stories with you," he said. "Remember the value of teamwork, empathy, courage, and reflection in everything you do. Share these lessons with others, and your community will continue to grow stronger, kinder, and more connected." The townspeople nodded, their faces full of gratitude, respect, and quiet joy. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the town, the square emptied slowly. People returned to their homes, but the energy of the day lingered in their hearts. Families shared the final story they had created, friends discussed the lessons they had learned, and children proudly showed their sketches, notes, and ideas. The town itself seemed transformed, not in grand or obvious ways, but subtly, in the way people observed, reflected, and interacted with one another. A sense of unity, understanding, and curiosity had been awakened, and it was likely to remain for a long time. That night the stars twinkled above the quiet town, and a gentle peace settled over the streets. The story of the dolls had reached its conclusion, but its lessons would endure. The townspeople had discovered the power of creativity, reflection, and shared experience. They had learned that even small, simple acts, like observing, imagining, and telling stories, could have profound effects on a community. The dolls, once merely objects of curiosity, had become symbols of connection, learning, and inspiration. In the days that followed, the town continued to feel the impact of the past 5 days. People looked at each other differently, with more patience, understanding, and appreciation. Children were more imaginative in their play, adults were more thoughtful in their decisions, and the community as a whole felt closer, stronger, and more connected. The lessons of courage, empathy, cooperation, and creativity were no longer abstract. They were part of the town's daily life, quietly shaping how people interacted, learned, and grew together. And so the story ended, not with a dramatic event or loud celebration, but with quiet reflection, understanding, and unity. The town had experienced something extraordinary. A simple set of dolls, carefully presented and guided, had sparked learning, growth, and connection in ways that were profound and lasting. The memory of the dolls, the stories, and the shared experiences would remain in the hearts and minds of the townspeople, a reminder that curiosity, creativity, and empathy are some of the most powerful forces in the world. The sun set completely, the sky turning a deep blue, and the town finally settled into a peaceful night. Yet in the hearts of everyone who had been part of this experience, there was a quiet glow, a spark of inspiration, understanding, and hope. The dolls had left, but their lessons remained, ready to guide the community into the future, reminding them always of the power of imagination, learning, and connection.